On a crisp autumn morning in the bustling downtown area, State Senator Richardson was running late for a community meeting. She had spent the early hours reviewing legislation on police reform, ironically unaware of how personal this issue would become in the next few hours. Dressed in her casual weekend attire, jeans and a simple blouse, she looked like any other citizen going about their day. As she navigated through the morning traffic in her modest sedan, she noticed a patrol car following her for several blocks. Initially, she thought nothing of it, having grown accustomed to the increased police presence in the area. However, the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror caught her attention. Pulling over to the side of the road, she remained calm, having experienced similar situations before. The officer approached her vehicle with a hand resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape her notice. Through her side mirror, she observed his rigid posture and stern expression. Years of working on community relations had taught her to recognize when an officer was approaching a situation with predetermined assumptions. "License and registration," the officer demanded without a greeting, his tone notably harsh. As she reached for her documents, she noticed how he tensed up, his hand gripping his holster more firmly. The situation felt eerily familiar, not from personal experience, but from the countless testimonies she had heard during committee hearings on law enforcement reform. She handed over her documents with steady hands, maintaining her composure despite the officer's increasingly aggressive demeanor. The officer barely glanced at her license before launching into an accusatory tirade about a supposed traffic violation. According to him, she had run a stop sign, one she knew didn't exist on the route she had taken. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to leave no room for discussion. As she complied, she could feel the eyes of passing motorists on her. Some slowed down to watch, while others hurriedly drove past, pretending not to notice the unfolding scene. Standing beside her car, she remained silent as the officer continued his hostile questioning. His assumptions were clear in every word he spoke, every gesture he made. He asked about her destination, her purpose in this part of town, and whether the car was really hers, questions that revealed more about his prejudices than any actual concern for law enforcement. What the officer didn't realize was that not only was he speaking to a state senator, but he was also providing a first-hand demonstration of exactly why she had been pushing for police reform legislation. Each moment of this interaction would later become powerful testimony in her ongoing fight for accountability and equal treatment under the law. The situation began to draw more attention. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk, some discreetly recording with their phones. The officer seemed to grow more agitated by the audience, his commands becoming shorter and his tone more clipped. He began to reach for his handcuffs, apparently deciding that this routine traffic stop needed to escalate further. As she watched him prepare to take this unnecessary step, Senator Richardson maintained her dignity and poise. She knew that what happened next would either reinforce everything wrong with the current system or become a catalyst for the change she had been fighting for. The morning sun continued to rise over the city streets, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the dark undertones of this encounter, as both officer and senator stood at a crossroads of justice, prejudice, and power. The gathered crowd grew larger, their murmurs of concern creating a backdrop to this tense scene. Among them were some of her constituents, though the officer remained oblivious to her identity and position. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for her personal safety, but for the larger narrative of law enforcement reform in their state. This incident would soon become more than just another story of racial profiling, it would become a powerful testament to the ongoing need for change in law enforcement practices and a reminder that no one, regardless of their position in society, was immune to such treatment. The tension in the air reached its peak as the officer gripped his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the morning sunlight. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, documenting every moment of this increasingly volatile situation. The sounds of passing traffic seemed to fade into the background as the confrontation intensified. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, his voice carrying a mix of authority and barely concealed hostility. Senator Richardson, however, remained composed. Her years of experience in handling high-pressure situations in the state legislature had prepared her for moments like this. "Officer," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to speak with your supervisor." The request, though perfectly reasonable, seemed to agitate the officer further. His face flushed with anger, interpreting her calm demeanor as a challenge to his authority. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "That's our state senator," she called out. The officer's head snapped toward the voice, his expression shifting from anger to confusion, then to disbelief. But he quickly masked his surprise, doubling down on his aggressive stance. "I don't care who she claims to be," he responded loudly, addressing the crowd more than Senator Richardson. "The law applies to everyone." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all the senator, who had spent years fighting for exactly that principle, though not in the way the officer was currently demonstrating. At that moment, a second patrol car pulled up to the scene. The supervisor the senator had requested stepped out, immediately assessing the situation with experienced eyes. The gathering crowd, the phones recording everything, and most importantly, the respected state legislator being threatened with arrest, he knew this was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. The supervisor, recognizing Senator Richardson from various community events and legislative sessions, quickly approached. "Senator," he acknowledged, his tone respectful but concerned. "Is everything all right here?" The first officer's face drained of color as the reality of the situation finally hit him. Senator Richardson maintained her professional demeanor as she calmly explained the series of events that had led to this moment. The supervisor listened intently, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. The original officer stood frozen, his hand still resting on his handcuffs, as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. The crowd continued to grow, and social media was already buzzing with initial clips of the incident. Local news vans began arriving, drawn by the tips from vigilant citizens who recognized the significance of what was unfolding. The morning sun now hung higher in the sky, casting harsh light on a scene that would soon become a focal point for discussions about police reform across the state. The supervisor pulled the officer aside for a private conversation, their hushed voices barely audible to the onlookers. The officer's shoulders slumped as he received what was clearly a stern reprimand. Meanwhile, Senator Richardson took the opportunity to address the concerned citizens who had gathered, turning this moment of potential tragedy into an impromptu community meeting. She spoke quietly with several witnesses, collecting their contact information and listening to their own stories of similar encounters. Each conversation reinforced what she already knew: this incident, while personally troubling, was far from unique. It was merely another example of the systemic issues she had been fighting to address in the legislature. As the morning wore on, local community leaders began arriving at the scene, drawn by the rapid spread of news through social media. What had started as a routine traffic stop had evolved into an unexpected but powerful gathering of citizens concerned about police conduct and racial profiling in their community. The incident was quickly becoming more than just another example of racial bias in law enforcement. It was transforming into a catalyst for change, a real-world demonstration of exactly why police reform legislation was so desperately needed. The very law enforcement practices that Senator Richardson had been working to reform were now on full display, with her own experience serving as undeniable evidence of the problem's persistence. By early afternoon, Senator Richardson found herself seated in the police chief's office, surrounded by an atmosphere thick with tension and bureaucratic damage control. The chief, a veteran of both law enforcement and political diplomacy, sat across from her, his expression a careful blend of concern and professionalism. "Senator, on behalf of our department, I want to express our deepest apologies for this morning's incident," the chief began, his hands clasped tightly on his desk. Through the office windows, they could see news vans still parked outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees seeking sunlight. The senator's response was measured but firm. "Chief, what happened to me this morning happens to countless citizens every day. The only difference is that I have a title that made your officer pause. What about those who don't?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth and years of unaddressed grievances. The meeting continued as various department heads filtered in and out of the office, each bringing reports and statistics that only confirmed what the senator already knew from her legislative work. The officer involved had a history of complaints, most of them involving similar incidents of apparent racial profiling, yet he had remained on active duty. Outside the police station, the community's response was growing. Social media was ablaze with video clips from the morning's incident, each one showing a different angle of the confrontation. Local organizers had already begun planning a peaceful demonstration for the following day, turning the senator's experience into a rallying cry for change. Back in the chief's office, Senator Richardson pulled out her tablet, showing the police leadership team the draft legislation she had been working on for months. The morning's events had given her invaluable first-hand experience to strengthen her proposals. As she walked them through the reforms, she could see the impact of her personal story reflecting in their eyes. "This isn't about punishing police officers," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen both sides of the issue. "It's about creating a system that serves and protects everyone equally." She shared statistics, studies, and most importantly, stories from constituents who had faced similar situations but lacked the power to make their voices heard. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows as the meeting continued. Department heads took notes, asked questions, and for perhaps the first time, truly listened to perspectives they had previously dismissed. The senator's experience had forced them to confront the reality of their department's practices in a way that no amount of external criticism had managed before. Meanwhile, the officer from the morning incident sat in another room, writing his report under supervision. His hands trembled slightly as he documented his actions, each word typed serving as a reminder of how quickly assumptions and prejudices could escalate a routine situation into a career-defining mistake. Local community leaders had gathered in the station's lobby, their presence a silent reminder of the public's growing demand for accountability. Among them were religious leaders, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had experienced similar treatment but had never had their stories heard. The senator's phone buzzed continuously with messages from colleagues in the state legislature. Many who had previously been hesitant about supporting police reform were now reaching out, expressing their shock at the incident and their newfound willingness to back her proposed changes. As the day progressed, what had started as a frightening confrontation was transforming into something more significant. The incident was becoming a turning point in the ongoing dialogue about police reform, racial profiling, and the need for systemic change. The senator's personal experience had put a face to the statistics, making it impossible for anyone to deny the reality of the situation. The media outside continued to grow, with national news networks picking up the story. What happened on those city streets was no longer just a local incident, it was becoming a symbol of a larger struggle for justice and equality under the law. Each passing hour brought new revelations, new perspectives, and most importantly, new opportunities for meaningful change in how law enforcement interacted with the communities they served. As evening approached, Senator Richardson sat in her home office, reviewing the flood of emails, messages, and calls that had poured in throughout the day. Her morning confrontation had sparked a nationwide conversation, with social media platforms ablaze with discussions about police reform and racial profiling. The video clips from the incident had gone viral, reaching millions of views in just hours. News channels were running continuous coverage, featuring interviews with witnesses, legal experts, and civil rights activists. The senator's phone hadn't stopped ringing since she'd left the police station, with requests for interviews coming in from major networks across the country. She opened her laptop to begin drafting a statement, knowing her words would need to bridge the growing divide between law enforcement and the community. The cursor blinked on the screen as she carefully chose her words, wanting to transform this personal incident into meaningful change rather than just another headline. In another part of town, the officer involved sat at his kitchen table, his badge and gun placed before him. His family watched news coverage of the incident in the next room, the volume low but the weight of the situation heavy in their home. His teenage daughter had already shown him comments about the incident on her social media feeds, her eyes reflecting confusion and disappointment. At the local community center, an emergency meeting was underway. Religious leaders, activists, and concerned citizens packed the main hall, sharing their own stories of similar encounters. The senator's experience had opened a floodgate of testimonies, each person finding the courage to speak up about incidents they had previously kept to themselves. Back at the police station, internal affairs investigators worked late into the evening, pulling records and reviewing body camera footage. The chief had ordered a comprehensive review of not just this incident, but all similar complaints filed over the past 5 years. The department's public affairs office was overwhelmed with media inquiries and public records requests. Senator Richardson's legislative aide arrived at her house with boxes of documents, years of research, statistics, and testimony about police reform that they had collected. Together, they began updating their proposed legislation, incorporating lessons from the day's events. What had been theoretical arguments were now strengthened by vivid, personal experience. On social media, #State Senator Profiling was trending nationwide. People shared their own stories of racial profiling, creating a powerful narrative that couldn't be ignored. Civil rights organizations began organizing peaceful protests in cities across the state, calling for immediate action on police reform legislation. The senator's colleagues in the legislature were scheduling an emergency session to address the incident. Those who had previously opposed reform measures were now facing intense pressure from their constituents to support change. The political landscape was shifting rapidly, with former opponents reaching out to discuss compromise solutions. Local business leaders also joined the conversation, releasing statements supporting police reform and pledging to fund community programs aimed at improving relations between law enforcement and residents. Several prominent companies announced plans to require implicit bias training for all employees, inspired by the day's events. As night fell, the senator received an unexpected call from the governor's office. The governor, who had previously been hesitant to support comprehensive police reform, now wanted to discuss fast-tracking legislation. The incident had made it impossible to continue ignoring the need for systemic change. The officer's supervisor sat in his office, reviewing personnel files and training procedures. He thought about all the warning signs he might have missed, the complaints he had dismissed, and the changes he could have implemented sooner. The incident had forced him to confront his own role in perpetuating a flawed system. Community organizers worked through the night, planning a series of town hall meetings to discuss police reform. They wanted to ensure that the momentum from this incident led to lasting change rather than just temporary outrage. The senator's experience had given them a powerful platform to advocate for reforms they had long sought. The national conversation continued to grow, with civil rights leaders from across the country planning to visit the state. What had started as a routine traffic stop was evolving into a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for equal justice under the law. The incident had put a spotlight on issues that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. As dawn broke the next day, Senator Richardson stood at her office window, watching demonstrators gather in the plaza below the state capitol. Handmade signs bobbed in the morning breeze, their messages calling for justice and change. The crowd was diverse: students, professionals, parents with children, all united in their demand for police reform. Inside the Capitol building, an unprecedented scene was unfolding. Legislators who had long opposed police reform were huddled in small groups, discussing the political fallout from yesterday's incident. The video evidence was undeniable, and their constituents were demanding action. The senator's office had become a hub of activity, with staff members coordinating meetings and organizing the flood of support pouring in. The police department had placed the officer on administrative leave, but this routine response felt inadequate given the circumstances. Internal affairs investigators had discovered more troubling patterns in the officer's record, previous complaints that had been dismissed, warning signs that had been ignored. Each revelation added fuel to the growing demand for systemic change. Local news stations aired interviews with residents from the senator's district, each sharing their own experiences with law enforcement. A retired teacher spoke about being pulled over 3 times in 1 month without cause. A business owner described watching his customers being harassed by patrol officers. A young professional shared how she had changed her route to work to avoid certain police checkpoints. At the community center, volunteers organized a support network for individuals who had experienced similar encounters. Legal aid organizations offered free consultations, helping people document their experiences and file formal complaints. The senator's incident had created a safe space for others to come forward, their collective voices growing stronger by the hour. The officer's family faced their own challenges. His children encountered harsh comments at school, while his wife fielded calls from concerned relatives. The incident had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about racial bias and privilege. Their dinner table conversations had shifted from routine daily matters to deep discussions about justice and equality. In the police academy across town, instructors hastily revised their training materials. The incident had exposed gaps in their curriculum, particularly around bias recognition and community relations. Veteran officers were brought in to share experiences and mistakes, creating a more nuanced understanding of their role in society. Senator Richardson's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. The officer's teenage daughter had reached out through social media. Her message was simple but powerful. Your experience has changed how I see the world. I'm sorry for what my father did, and I want to be part of the solution. The governor's office announced plans for a special commission on police reform, with the senator appointed as co-chair. The commission would include law enforcement officials, civil rights leaders, community representatives, and legal experts. Their mandate was clear: develop comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar incidents and rebuild trust between police and communities. Social media continued to amplify the conversation. The hashtag had evolved from simply sharing the incident to organizing action. People posted information about town hall meetings, shared resources for reporting police misconduct, and coordinated community support initiatives. The virtual activism was translating into real-world change. Inside the police station, younger officers engaged in heated debates with their older colleagues. The incident had created a generational divide, with newer recruits pushing for change while veterans defended traditional practices. The conversations were uncomfortable but necessary, forcing everyone to examine their assumptions and biases. The senator's legislative team worked through another long day, incorporating input from various stakeholders into their reform proposals. They focused on practical solutions: improved training protocols, transparent complaint procedures, community oversight boards, and clear consequences for misconduct. Each provision was carefully crafted to balance public safety with accountability. As evening approached again, a small group of officers visited the senator's office. They weren't there to apologize or defend their colleague. They came to share their own frustrations with a system that often put them at odds with the communities they served. Their perspectives added valuable insight to the ongoing reform discussions. The movement for change had gained unstoppable momentum. What started as one officer's biased actions had sparked a transformation in how people viewed law enforcement and community relations. The senator's experience had become a catalyst for the very reforms she had long championed, proving that sometimes personal tragedy could lead to public triumph. The next morning, a historic session convened at the state legislature. The chamber was packed, with every seat filled and additional chairs brought in to accommodate the overflow crowd. News cameras lined the walls, their lenses focused on Senator Richardson as she approached the podium to present her comprehensive police reform bill. She stood tall, her voice clear and determined as she addressed her colleagues. The personal experience that had brought them to this moment added weight to every word she spoke. "What happened to me was not unique," she began. "What is unique is that I have the power to stand here today and demand change. How many others have suffered in silence?" The gallery erupted in applause as she outlined the key components of her legislation. Body cameras with strict activation requirements. Mandatory de-escalation training. An independent review board for civilian complaints. Regular psychological evaluations for officers. Each provision was met with nods of approval from legislators who had previously opposed such measures. In the police department, a transformation was already underway. The chief had implemented immediate changes in training procedures, not waiting for the legislation to pass. Senior officers were required to attend community meetings, not just to speak, but to listen. The department's leadership recognized that rebuilding trust would require more than just policy changes. Outside the Capitol, the crowds had grown larger. Community organizations had set up tables where people could register to vote and learn about their rights during police encounters. Local attorneys provided free consultations, helping citizens understand the current laws and the proposed changes. The atmosphere was one of determination rather than anger. The officer at the center of the incident had requested a meeting with the senator. After careful consideration, she agreed, seeing an opportunity for meaningful dialogue. The meeting was scheduled for later that week, with mediators present to facilitate what promised to be a difficult but necessary conversation. Social media continued to play a crucial role in maintaining momentum. People shared stories of positive police interactions alongside accounts of misconduct, creating a more nuanced discussion about law enforcement reform. The hashtag had evolved into a movement, with organized chapters forming in cities across the state. In police academies statewide, curriculum changes were being implemented. Future officers would now spend more time in community engagement programs before receiving their badges. Mental health professionals were brought in to teach de-escalation techniques. Cultural sensitivity training became a core requirement rather than an optional module. The senator's office had become a hub for reform efforts. Civil rights leaders met with law enforcement officials, finding common ground in their shared desire for safer communities. Veterans officers shared insights about the pressures they faced, while community members explained how certain police practices affected their daily lives. Local businesses joined the effort, offering their spaces for community police dialogue sessions. Coffee shops hosted cop conversations, where officers and residents could talk informally. Recreation centers organized youth police basketball games. Small steps toward understanding were happening everywhere. The media coverage had evolved from sensational headlines to thoughtful analysis. Investigative reporters dug into police training budgets, highlighting how underfunding contributed to inadequate preparation. Stories about successful police reform in other jurisdictions provided blueprints for change. Inside the state capitol, legislators worked late into the night, fine-tuning the reform bill. Every word was scrutinized, every provision debated. The goal was to create legislation that would bring real change while being practical to implement. The senators' experience had shown them the human cost of getting it wrong. As the reform package took shape, it became clear that this would be more than just a reaction to one incident. The bill addressed systemic issues, hiring practices, promotion criteria, disciplinary procedures, and community oversight. It created mechanisms for identifying problem officers before incidents occurred. The evening news featured interviews with police officers' families, adding another dimension to the discussion. They spoke about their fears, both for their loved ones' safety and for the communities they served. Their perspectives helped humanize the debate, showing that everyone had a stake in getting this right. A week after the incident, Senator Richardson sat across from the officer who had stopped her, in a carefully arranged meeting room at a neutral community center. The tension in the air was palpable as they faced each other for the first time since that fateful morning. Two mediators were present, along with representatives from both the police union and civil rights organizations. The officer appeared different now, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, his demeanor subdued rather than authoritative. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. The incident had taken its toll on him too, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his actions and beliefs. "I've spent every night since then watching that video," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep trying to justify my actions, but I can't. I saw what I wanted to see that morning, not what was actually there." The senator listened intently, her face showing neither anger nor judgment, but rather the practiced patience of someone who had long worked for systematic change. The conversation that followed was raw and honest. The officer spoke about his upbringing, his training, and the subtle ways bias had crept into his daily work. He shared stories about the pressures of the job, the fear that accompanied each traffic stop, and how that fear sometimes transformed into prejudice. Meanwhile, outside the community center, life in the city was transforming. Police officers were now required to attend weekly community engagement sessions. Citizens who had once hurried past patrol cars now stopped to chat with officers they recognized from neighborhood meetings. Small changes were creating ripples of progress. The police department had begun implementing new protocols even before the legislation passed. Officers were paired with community mentors, spending time in neighborhoods not just as law enforcement, but as neighbors and friends. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Back in the meeting room, the senator shared her own story, not just of that morning, but of a lifetime of similar experiences. She spoke about the fear she felt when her teenage son started driving, the careful instructions she had to give him about how to behave during traffic stops, the constant worry that came with being a parent in a world where such incidents were all too common. The officer listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time understanding the full impact of actions he had previously dismissed as routine police work. Tears welled in his eyes as he recognized patterns in his behavior that he had never before acknowledged. As the meeting progressed, the conversation shifted from personal experiences to practical solutions. The officer offered insights into police training gaps that needed to be addressed. The senator shared ideas about how to build better relationships between law enforcement and the community. Together, they began sketching out proposals for change that would be both meaningful and implementable. Local news crews waited outside, but both parties had agreed that this conversation would remain private. This wasn't about creating headlines, it was about finding understanding and moving forward. The media would later report only that a productive dialogue had taken place. In the police academy across town, new recruits watched body camera footage from various incidents, including the senator's stop, as part of their enhanced training program. They discussed not just procedures and protocols, but the human impact of their actions. Veteran officers shared their experiences, both good and bad, creating an atmosphere of openness and learning. The senator's reform bill continued to gain support, with amendments and improvements suggested by both law enforcement and community leaders. What had started as a response to one incident was evolving into a comprehensive plan for transforming police-community relations. As evening approached, the meeting between the senator and the officer concluded with an unexpected moment of connection. They discovered they had both grown up in the same neighborhood, albeit decades apart. This simple coincidence served as a reminder of their shared humanity and the possibility of finding common ground. The city had changed in just a week, but everyone understood that real transformation would take time, patience, and continued effort. The incident that had sparked this change was just the beginning of a longer journey toward justice and understanding. 1 month after the incident, Senator Richardson stood at the podium in the state capitol as the governor signed the Comprehensive Police Reform Bill into law. The room was filled with an unlikely coalition, police officers standing shoulder to shoulder with community activists, civil rights leaders alongside law enforcement officials. The journey from confrontation to collaboration had transformed not just policies, but people. The legislation, now known as the Community Trust and Police Accountability Act, represented the most significant reform of law enforcement practices in the state's history. But beyond the legal changes, there was a deeper transformation taking place in how police and communities interacted with each other. The officer who had stopped the senator that morning was now leading training sessions for his fellow officers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a path to redemption. His personal transformation had become a powerful teaching tool, showing how confronting one's biases could lead to genuine change. In police departments across the state, the new training protocols were already showing results. Complaints of racial profiling had decreased significantly. Officers were spending more time walking neighborhoods, attending community events, and building relationships. The warrior mentality was being replaced by a guardian approach to policing. The senator's office had become a model for other states looking to implement similar reforms. Delegations from across the country visited to study the changes and understand how they could be adapted to their own communities. The incident that had sparked these reforms was now being taught in law enforcement academies nationwide. Local schools had implemented new programs bringing police officers and students together in positive settings. Officers coached sports teams, mentored students, and participated in classroom discussions about law enforcement and community relations. These interactions were breaking down barriers and building trust with the next generation. The media coverage had evolved from focusing on the initial incident to highlighting success stories of police-community cooperation. News reports featured officers and citizens working together on neighborhood improvement projects, joint volunteer initiatives, and community safety programs. Technology played a crucial role in the reforms. Body cameras were now standard equipment, with clear protocols for their use. A new mobile app allowed citizens to rate their interactions with police officers, providing valuable feedback for department leadership. Data analytics helped identify patterns and potential problems before they escalated. The officer's daughter, who had reached out to the senator after the incident, had started a youth organization promoting dialogue between teens and law enforcement. Her group organized workshops, social events, and community service projects that brought young people and police officers together in positive ways. At the police department, the culture had shifted dramatically. Officers who had initially resisted the changes were now seeing the benefits of the new approach. Response times hadn't suffered, but job satisfaction had improved. Officers reported feeling more connected to the communities they served. The senator continued to work closely with law enforcement agencies, ensuring that the reforms were being implemented effectively. She regularly attended roll calls and training sessions, maintaining the personal connection that had made the legislation so powerful. Her experience had given her unique credibility with both police and community members. Community organizations that had once protested police practices were now partners in public safety efforts. Regular meetings between police leadership and community representatives helped address concerns before they became conflicts. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. The state had become a national model for police reform, proving that meaningful change was possible when all stakeholders worked together. Visitors from other states came to study the program, often leaving with hope that similar transformations could happen in their own communities. As the ceremony concluded and the governor handed her the pen used to sign the bill, Senator Richardson reflected on the journey. What had started as a frightening and humiliating experience had led to real, lasting change. The incident had shown that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes, if people were willing to learn, grow, and work together for positive change.